Good morning or afternoon. As a Serbian, I'm never sure what to say. My name is Nala Kelpic, and I'm the Outreach Director for Marsy's Law for Wisconsin. Thank you all for joining us as we mark National Crime Victims' Rights Week with today's roundtable discussion aimed at raising awareness about victims' constitutional and statutory rights. National Crime Victims' Rights Week this year falls at the same time we're celebrating the 1-year anniversary of Marsy's law passage in Wisconsin last April. As a survivor myself, it has been so heartening this past year to see Marsy's law at work, helping crime victims navigate a criminal justice system they were forced into through no fault of their own. Most victims, they walk in with zero experience and have little or no understanding of the criminal justice system. Our conversation today will focus on crime victims' rights and will provide practical tips on how to break down those barriers to accessing rights and demystifying the process. There will also be time for audience questions at the end, so please make sure you ask your questions using the chat feature. We are joined this afternoon by our wonderful panelists who graciously agreed to be part of this very important conversation. And I want to now turn the conversation over to our moderator, Assistant Attorney General Miriam Falk. Assistant Attorney General Falk is the state resource prosecutor and law enforcement trainer for sexual assault and domestic violence. She worked as an assistant district attorney in Milwaukee, assigned to the sensitive crime unit for the last 23 of her 27 years with the office. On a personal level, she has been an amazing resource to me over the last year. Miriam, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Nella, for those really kind words. It's amazing, though, because I'm only 29 years old, so it's how I could get all that experience, I don't know. So welcome to everybody for this afternoon. I am so glad that you have tuned in for this. As Nella said, this is really an opportunity for us who work in the system to give you some very practical information about victims' rights. Marsy's law, as many of you know, was a constitutional amendment. It is part of a nationwide push to elevate victims' rights to the level of the Constitution in the individual state. And that's what we did as voters. More than 75% of Wisconsin voters last April voted to enact Marsy's law. And so we have it. It became effective in May, and we have been working with this law for the last almost a year now. If I were to try to cull it down to a very short phrase about what Marsy's law is about, it is our opportunity in the criminal justice system to empower the victim voice and also to enable victim choice. And those are the driving forces behind it. So with that, what I'd like to do is introduce our panelists for this afternoon. It is a very distinguished group. And I want you all to feel free to ask questions in the chat. We're going to be going through some questions that we think are frequently asked questions by victims first. And then the last 20 minutes or so, we will have time to get to your particular questions. Our first panelist is Reggie Moore. He is the director of the City of Milwaukee Office of Violence Prevention, and there he is. He was appointed by Mayor Tom Baird in 2016 and leads the city's efforts to assess, prevent, and decrease incidents of structural and community violence. The Office of Violence Prevention advances its mission through partnerships that strengthen youth, families, and neighborhoods. An organizer at his core, Reggie has dedicated his life to being a servant leader, social innovator, and catalyst for change. Welcome to Reggie. Our next panelist is Carmen Petrie. She is the executive director of Wisconsin's largest service provider for families dealing with domestic violence, Sojourner Family Peace Center. With a multi-million-dollar annual budget, Ms. Pitre leads a staff that provides crisis housing, system advocacy, and individual support to thousands of women, men, and their children. I'm very pleased to introduce Natalie Hayden, who is herself a survivor of crime as well. She is a woman of servitude, vision, and purpose. Natalie embodies a no-nonsense approach in her message and coaching style. Transparent, intentional, truthful, humorous, impactful, and wise, she is a living testimony to the value in life's valleys and the power of acts of love through community impact. Natalie serves on Sojourner Programs Committee and Voices Advisory, and in addition is serving on the City of Milwaukee Commission on Sensitive Crimes. Welcome to you, Natalie. Marianna Rodriguez is the director of the UMOS Latina Resource Center. UMOS is Milwaukee's first bilingual center for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. And she established this in 2001 with one other advocate. Wow. In 2012, then FBI Director Robert Mueller, that's right, that Robert Mueller, recognized Marianna with a Community Leadership Award for her fearless advocacy for women and girls. Welcome to you, Marianna. And finally, we have Matthew Torbinson, who is the Deputy District Attorney here in Milwaukee County. I had the distinct pleasure and privilege to work with Matt for many years at the DA's office. As a Deputy District Attorney, Matt supervises the Child Protection and Advocacy Unit, the Domestic Violence Unit, and the Sensitive Crimes Unit. Prior to being a district attorney, Matthew served as an assistant district attorney and was the team captain of the Child Protection and Advocacy Unit within the Milwaukee County DA's office. DA John Chisholm formed that unit in September of 2008 to provide a greater focus on the protection of child victims and to hold those who abuse or neglect children to a higher level of accountability. And DA Chisholm chose Matt Torbinson to lead this initiative. So welcome to you, Matt, as well. All right, if everybody is ready, these are the couple of things I'm just going to remind everybody in the audience to put your questions in the chat feature. And if there are reporters in our audience and you wish to ask any questions, if you would please identify who you are and which outlet you're from so that I will know and I will be able to speak that out for everybody listening. So here we go. I'm going to direct this first question to Natalie, since I really believe that our survivor voices are the most important ones here. The first victim right identified in Marsy's law is to be treated with respect, dignity, courtesy, sensitivity, and fairness. And of course, the primary objective of all of these constitutional rights, which embody Marsy's law, is a fostering of a cultural climate of respect for victims, as opposed to adherence to stereotypes or biases that can lead to poor treatment. Having been through the criminal justice experience, Natalie, how would you describe what worked and what didn't work with regard to the treatment that you received as you processed through the system?
Good morning, or good afternoon, rather. Thank you, Mrs. Falk, for that question. Thinking 4 years back, 2017, it's not too far for me. Navigating through the criminal justice system was definitely a very daunting experience for myself. Thankfully, what did work specifically was the advocacy the advocacy representation that I experienced with Sojourner Family Peace Center every step of the way, like providing me with that partnership and that that support was really essential and important. So that really did work for me. Being notified of the release of my ex-husband, that was something that did work for me. And that was amazing. However, there were many aspects of the process where I felt entirely invisible. Going through the system, and there was lack of communication between courts, family court, criminal court, to flag DV cases, where there was one point early on in the process that our commissioner ordered me to pay my ex-husband child support while in a domestic violence shelter. To me, that's a huge red flag. That's a loophole that one should never have to experience. Yet that was my experience. Also being, forced to constantly be re-traumatized as cases were constantly being re-spent out because it did not or was not considered priority. So my case was constantly, after a year being spent out, went to trial. And then by that time, once you're on the stand, you forget information. And as you've experienced trauma, there's things that you cannot recall. So it does not necessarily resonate with the jury. And my husband was let off because of lack of evidence, or evidence that was, it just wasn't significant at the moment, a year later. So there are so many things that did not work. However, it just really allowed me to appreciate Marsy's law that can then now add visibility to those things that were so faulty and invisible in my process.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm glad the things that did work well for you. And some of the points that you raised, I think, are really so important. No victim should ever feel invisible. And I completely appreciate that your case being adjourned over and over again is beyond frustrating. And I see everybody else is nodding their head. I completely appreciate how that is awful. The other thing I will indicate too is that what you are describing in terms of the gaps in your memory or the fragments in your memory is very consistent with the trauma that all victims experience, really. And one of the things that we're doing where I work, which is the Department of Justice, is trying to educate law enforcement officers and also prosecutors regarding how trauma impacts memory, so that we can do a better job facilitating the victim ability to provide us with information and also provide explanations when a jury is trying to assess things like credibility. So I really appreciate that comment from you. Does anybody else have anything that they would like to add before I move on to Marianna and our second question? All righty, very good. Let's go on to Marianna Rodriguez. Thank you again, Natalie. All right, so Marianna works in our advocacy world, and we know, as we just heard, that the criminal justice system can be overwhelming and confusing, really even on the best of days for a victim. Most people who engage with the system as a crime victim, they don't know much about what the system is about, if they know anything at all, regarding how things operate or even what their rights are. Now, Marsy's law aims to empower victim voices and choices by providing notification of rights, which is something that Natalie has already mentioned, notification of proceedings, another notification that we are working hard to make sure victims have, and also choices about what might or might not happen by providing opportunities to be heard at proceedings and also to speak with the attorney for the government. So Marianna, as an advocate working with victims, how do victims learn of their rights? Like, how do they know what they are, and who helps them to exercise them when they want to?
Well, good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel over something that I'm really very passionate about when it comes down to victims' rights and protecting the rights of victims of crime, particularly in domestic violence or sexual assault and human trafficking. As I'm listening to Natalie and her experience, the immediate thing that came to my mind in describing the rights and who provides that ongoing support for victims. And that really lies a lot in the power of advocates. Both systems advocates and community advocates, like us at the Latina Resource Center, we have advocates that are, here in the community, and we really make ourselves available to victims who are in the system who reported to law enforcement or the incidents to law enforcement, or victims who are very afraid. And often victims are afraid because they don't understand what to expect, right? And so victims play a really big role in terms of what Natalie said, navigating systems and coordinating with our partners like the district attorney's office and victim witness. So when we talk about education, it's a team. It's a tribe in which we need to really have a lot of ongoing communication between advocates who are in the community and advocates who are in the system. And I think, with advocates, we play several roles here. One is to provide emotional support for victims. Victims are very afraid. They're very overwhelmed, unsure, confused, and may not understand fully aspect of systems. And then that also plays out with individuals who are not English speaking too. So just add that piece to that. Or individuals who may not have citizenship, right? All these factors play a part in being able to really kind of understand what these systems are. And so advocates play a really big role in terms of, one, making sure that we are providing that emotional support, because victims are extremely afraid and concerned and confused. And we want to bring some calmness to that and be able to provide some clarity. And nothing better than to feel emotional safe, right? When it comes down to, information that you're getting and how that's going to benefit my current situation. Second is to consistently assess the safety of victims. Once clients, once we've seen that, this thing that get a restraining order and you're going to be safe. And that's not always the case. Getting a restraining order now means being in the system now complicates a lot of things in the life of the victim. Is this person safe? How do we identify other resources to make sure we bring some stability in the life of a victim who now is involved and is in the process, in the judicial process, or the case is in the judicial process. And so we have to make sure we assess that. And, and also then be able to then coordinate between two systems, the DA's office, and figure out what's the next step, taking the victim to hearings, explaining to them what's to expect from this whole process. What does it mean to come in and talk to the DA? What does it mean for pre-trials? What does it mean for, for all of these ongoing meetings that are going to take place throughout the court, throughout this whole judicial system? What we found is that when they don't have an advocate that can help them understand each step of the way, you can lose them, and then they will not be engaged in the system. And that becomes even more difficult when we're trying to find ways of how to hold the perpetrator accountable, one, and for the victim to get the sense of justice. And so, so it takes a lot of, reiterating and re-educating and framing all this real, very difficult concepts and steps of court. And, it's always going to take, reminders, checking in on the client. How did you feel about talking to the DA? How do you understand this? Because we can understand the system and we can be overwhelmed with so much information. And so the advocates really help to coordinate that. Play kind of, like the liaison with the DA, follow up with them. So what are we expecting here? When is the next court hearing? Supporting the client, reminding them of the hearings, checking in with their emotions. And so, always being able to provide that education, awareness of what this all means when it comes down to victims' rights. And so I think advocates, it starts with an advocate. It starts with the advocates really being great partners with, with our programs, with the systems advocates, and making sure that we are always by our, walking alongside the victims throughout the whole judicial process, because if we don't, we will lose them. They are going to be too overwhelmed. And so, so it, you know, I hope that kind of helps describe the complexities of things, but that is what our hopes are when we look at you know, providing that who actually initiates all that, and to both victim and advocate in a sense.
Right. Thank you, Marianna. That was, that really highlighted the role of the advocate. Before I make a comment, does anybody else want to add anything to what Marianna described about the role of the advocate and how victims get notified of rights? Okay, I guess I will just reiterate again how important the advocate role is with respect to the victim. So, you know, in Natalie's case, because of the type of case that hers was, often in those kinds of cases, there are community advocates, and there would also be a systems advocate. So somebody who works in the DA's office for non-sensitive crime victims. You know, as maybe some of the folks that Mr. Moore works with, they might only get the system advocate. You know, if your family member has been murdered through gun violence, for instance, you'd still have a system advocate. Those advocates are all really important for passing on information, for being a conduit between you and the prosecutor, between you and the court. And so engaging with your community advocate and with your system advocate, your victim witness person, it really is a very effective way for victims to be exercising their rights and getting their voices heard. I think that that is really important. One of the things that I heard that Marianna say too is that there are definitely barriers that exist that prevent people from making a report of a crime. And I really want to encourage people, if you have been the victim of a crime, to consider reporting that crime. In order for us to really work hard to reduce violence in our community, to figure out, you know, how criminals operate, to get criminals off the streets and to be held accountable, we can't do that without the report of a crime victim. And as challenging as it can be sometimes, whether you don't speak English or whether you're from a community maybe where you're afraid that you're going to get deported, or you know, maybe you're from a community where in your culture, it might be frowned upon to go outside of your culture to make a crime report. You can talk with a community advocate, and that conversation is confidential. And I think that's a really helpful step sometimes for people to learn about their options.
Miriam, I would add, you know, we've always known Sojourner's been embedded in the DA's office since the late 80s, early 90s for that reason. We understand that people need both a confidential and a non-confidential conversation around what's going on for them. There's many times survivors want to talk about things that they do not want reported or do not want it to be part of the case processing. So I think that is a critical point to make, that community advocates such as Latina Resource Center or our advocates offer confidentiality. In some instances, we might have to breach that if there's threat of a homicide or threat of suicide, but mostly what's intact is this safe space to talk about what's happening for you, the exchange of information, as Marianna said. I also want to highlight the role of law enforcement. They are the first ones on the scene that hand out the green form to people right on the scene, that informs you at probably the worst time possible what your constitutional rights are. But that's where it begins. Long before you begin to talk to an advocate, is you get a listing, and then how you make meaning of those rights is when you begin to interact with a confidential and a non-confidential advocate. And it's really the relationship between those two entities that helps survivors navigate the complexities of all of the systems, the civil court system, the criminal court system, children's court, as well as the family court system. And all of them can be operating at the same time, which can be confusing and complex.
Thank you.
Thank you for saying that, Carmen, because I think what happens too is that is that, you know, when we're handed the experience of any victim is that when you're handed a piece of paper, it doesn't, you know, sometimes things are so chaotic and there's crisis happening that a lot of the times law enforcement cannot walk through that little slip in everything that's there. Often our experiences have been is that clients just kind of flip this paper, but absolutely no meaning what that is. You know, but when we look at, you know, when we look at victims and we're looking at very, you know, in communities such as like the Latino community or the refugee community, there is this tremendous amount of sense of questioning of citizenship and whether their rights could be actually protected in a, you know, when they're still not citizens or they're still not, they don't hold status. And that plays a really big part in terms of then taking the next step of going to the DA's office next to, you know, talk to them about what's happened to them. And we've had experiences where they're walking with a piece of paper and we're like, well, we're supposed to see the DA's office and not understand what this all means in terms of, you know, being informed of your rights or being made aware of your rights versus really truly understanding and how to practice and how to really make that happen for yourself often goes back into the hands of both victim, the systems and the community advocates. And it takes a lot of collaborating and communicating and support between the advocates.
And then you factor in the trauma that people are going through.
Oh yeah.
You know, the ways that we can't operate fully when we're in crisis, we're in fight, flight, freeze, you know, and that whole process, it can take a while to understand what your rights are and make meaning of them. And really the advocate, as Marianna said, helps you navigate that. Matt wanted to jump in.
I thought it was a good time to highlight Wisconsin's accompaniment law, which allows a advocate to be present with a survivor during the law enforcement investigation phase. And it really, when we've seen it work well, law enforcement's allowed to do its investigation. The advocate works with the victim to help process the trauma, but also to be a support and resource there for the victim during the reporting of the crime. And the accompaniment law is another really strong law in Wisconsin that really helps support Marsy's law and the rights of victims. And I just wanted to highlight that law real quick.
Thank you. Excellent. Boy, this is an excellent discussion, and I thank you all for all of this. Again, I really stress the connection between advocacy and a crime victim is absolutely essential for your ability really to meaningfully work through the system. I was a crime victim last fall and I got the green form, which is 3 pages of, I got it in English, but it comes in Spanish and it comes in Hmong as well. But it is overwhelming and I understand the system. So, you know, law enforcement tries very hard to highlight the most critical things in there for you. But honestly, if you ever get that green form, hang on to it, because at a moment when your brain is back down to its more normal functioning, you're going to want to read through it again. And you certainly are going to want to look at it with an advocate. Let's move on to the next question here, because Marianna and Carmen and Natalie, all 3 of you opened the door to this, and I think it's so important. Often, as you guys have mentioned, it is a police officer who has the very first contact with a crime victim. In fact, usually that's the case. And we just heard about how law enforcement plays a really important role in notifying the victims of what their rights are. You get the green form. But of particular concern to many, if not most victims, is their safety. Something that Natalie talked about, something that Marianna talked about, and something that Carmen talked about. And I'm sure, you know, when we give Reggie a chance to get a word in edgeways here, he's gonna confirm that, you know, the incidence of violence, the experience of violence is extremely discombobulating when it is your experience. It changes your world a lot. So Matt, what I'd like to ask you is about the constitutional right to reasonable protection from the accused throughout the criminal justice process. Can you tell us about how law enforcement and prosecution help ensure this reasonable protection?
So one of the many ways that we've used Marsy's Law to help protect victims is to, first of all, give them some anonymity in the process by using a different name or referring to the victim as victim one, for example, in the criminal complaint, so that the victim's identity isn't out there and open for the public. So individuals aren't searching the records, reaching out to the victim, contacting the victim. We're doing the same thing with police reports, which often contain personal identifying information for victims. Removing that, redacting the personal identifying information, having protective orders put in place by the courts so that that information is not circulated, not made public. It is also not given to the accused so that the accused can use it to reach out to the victim, to know where the victim lives, resides, to harass the victim. So those are multiple ways. We're using protective orders for discovery, for medical records, which often contain very private personal information of a victim inside those records, oftentimes information that may not be completely relevant to the case itself, additional information, background medical information, conditions that a victim may suffer from. And we're using protective orders to protect that information from either being turned over to the defense, or when it is turned over to the defense, from it being circulated beyond the defendant, just using it in the criminal case for their defense in the case. We're having records sealed after they've been filed with the court and when they are filed with the court. So for example, a victim impact statement, we may ask that it be filed confidentially. We may ask that it be sealed after it's used in the proceedings and during sentencing. Victim impact statements oftentimes carry very private, very detailed information about what the victim suffered, but also things such as where the victim may be receiving treatment that the offender doesn't need to know about. And so we'll have that information sealed and protected. We also do the same thing with restitution information. Marsy's Law, in essence, has given us an additional tool to seek protective orders in courtrooms, to keep the confidentiality and anonymity for victims during criminal proceedings protected, not only from the accused using it to harass the victim, but also from media attention on cases to protect the victim from having something going public and having their name out in the public and used to further embarrass and harass a victim of a crime. So those are just some of the many ways that we're using Marsy's Law to help protect victims inside the courtroom.
Thanks, Matt. And I'll mention one other thing, which is bail. Oftentimes we are, as prosecutors, asking for information that is relevant to the issue of bail. Are we going to be asking for cash bail? How much cash bail would be a good amount to ask? What are the resources in circumstances where there is interpersonal crime or where there has been, say, there like a home invasion or something like that? We want to make sure that we have as much information about conditions in case the offender gets released. So no contact orders with a particular named person or with a location, maybe where somebody works or their home, the school for where the kids are. So we can ask for those kinds of conditions too. And again, this goes back to that safety issue that everybody so far has brought up, and that connection between providing information to your advocate, really working with the advocate to get information to the prosecutor here. I'm blanking there. That's an age thing, 29, you know. But that information then getting translated into appropriate conditions for bail. Matt, you had a comment that you wanted to make.
There was a question from the audience about whether or not we keep victim impact statements from the accused, and we don't. We turn those over as part of discovery, but we may seek protective orders to have to cause the accused and others from circulating them further than they need to be for the legal proceedings. So they are turned over, especially if they contain exculpatory information, but they're always turned over.
Yeah, that's required under the law. So Again, but Marsy's law does, as Matt indicated, give us additional tools for keeping that information confidential and as private as we possibly can. You know, while I have you, Matt, on the line here, I think another concern that victims have, and you raised this already a little bit, is getting restitution to compensate them for their losses as a result of the crime. And this can be many different kinds of things, right? And you've also mentioned the victim impact statement, and getting that information about how a crime has impacted somebody in front of the court is also important to most victims. Now, under Marsy's law, victims have a right to confer with the attorney for the government, and they also have a right to have information about the physical and psychological and economic impact of the crime provided to the court, and then also to full restitution and assistance in collecting it. We know that restitution is usually addressed at the sentencing. So after somebody has been convicted, either because they entered a guilty plea or because a jury has found them guilty. So can you tell us a little bit about what it is that a victim can receive as part of a restitution order from the court, and also ways that that victim can work with the prosecutor to get that important information in front of the court?
One of the things I'm really proud of, especially about the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office, is our advocacy within the office. We have advocates in every single unit that help us reach out to victims as soon as we're reviewing a case. And one of the things I heard from Natalie when she was talking at the very beginning was about the delay in her case. And that was during normal times. We are now in a pandemic where the delays are unprecedented within the criminal case. We have cases, we only have 4 criminal courts open right now for jury trials, and normally Milwaukee County has 20. So that gives you an idea of how greatly reduced the criminal justice resources are to help victims and to process cases right now. It is incumbent upon the prosecutor, it's incumbent on our victim advocates throughout the duration of the proceedings to keep victims fully informed on how the case is progressing, what the status of the case is, what the victim's rights are at every single stage and every single proceeding, including telling the victim if and when we get to a sentencing hearing, what a victim can receive as potential restitution. And potential restitution incorporates lost wages because of the criminal offense. And that is something that oftentimes gets overlooked. Restitution incorporates costs for seeing a therapist, for example, any kind of mental health counseling that may be a result of the criminal case can be recovered through restitution, as can any loss of any physical property, any damaged physical property, any stolen physical property can be recovered. Those are the things that we generally think of that are pretty easy to off the top of our head when we think about restitution. But the thing that we often don't think about is, what about that mental anguish and that mental harm that a victim suffers as a result of the crime? And that too is something that a victim can receive recompense for as a result of the criminal offense.
All right, thank you, Matt. So one of the things that, has kind of been sort of floating under the surface of everything, of course, is that we have people who are reporting crimes. And I wanted to tap into Reggie's expertise for a little bit and just ask you, Reggie, if you can talk about, generally speaking, your experience, since I know that violent crime is, always at the top of people's concerns in our community. So if you could talk about what you're seeing in terms of the trends and barriers perhaps to reporting in terms of violent crime here in our community.
Thank you. I'll speak from this from 2 angles. One, as a survivor of violence myself, growing up in this city, but also obviously in my current role as the director of the Office of Violence Prevention, and working with community partners, both grassroots as well as many of the groups that are part of this panel. One of the things that we're seeing in terms of the interconnectedness to gun violence and other forms of violence in our city. We know that a lot of the shootings that we see are connected to arguments or conflict. Many of those conflicts have roots in either intimate partner or family related conflicts. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is to make sure we're not working in isolation and that we're connecting the dots and understanding that the interrelated nature of many of these conflicts. How do we actually support families? How do we provide resources? How do we promote people seeking resolution for the conflicts that are often ongoing? There was a recent mass shooting in our city that was related to a conflict that had been going on for over a month between an aunt and cousins. And so, again, these things can ultimately build up and explode. And we obviously see it on a daily basis with intimate partner and domestic violence. And so that's one of the trends that we've been paying attention to, understanding that due to the pandemic, a lot of stress and tension and critical elements of food insecurity, housing and economic insecurity increased a lot of stress in our community and continues to do so. So 2021 feels like deja vu to 2020 as it relates to violence in our city, but not only with the people on this panel, but people who are in the streets, working on the front line every day to address this issue is something that we have to continue to elevate. And as it relates to victim rights, I look at them as human rights and things that can, when someone has survived or experienced some form of harm, really underscores the way that we should be caring for each other every day in terms of treating people with dignity, respecting their rights, not violating them, and ensuring that they have access to equal justice and protection under the law. Unfortunately, we don't see that all the time in our community and throughout the country. And so these are systemic things that we have to address as we continue to also work to try to prevent and reduce interpersonal violence.
So I thank you for that. And again, I mean, it really, I hope you are all kind of seeing the web that I'm seeing of how all of this is very interconnected and how, I mean, even the information, the statistics and the facts that are really important to Reggie and his people for figuring out how violence is happening and where we might be able to interject is also very much connected back not just to the prosecutor's office and to law enforcement, but to our advocates as well, who are shepherding people, not just through the criminal justice system, but sometimes in other directions, right? And so all of that, this is a very interconnected web. So my last specific question here, I'm going to throw to Carmen. We haven't touched yet on the second right, which is the right to privacy. And I personally am very pleased with the fact that Wisconsin, unlike virtually every other state that has enacted some version of Marsy's law, recognizes the importance of privacy by making it a standalone right. Now, we know that what is private, of course, can be different from one person to another. And just like all the rest of the rights that are identified in Marsy's law, what is important in terms of keeping private can really ebb and flow throughout the course of the process. So what I'm hoping, Carmen, that you can explain are the kinds of things that victims might have a privacy interest in and how the various players in the system try to collaborate to protect victim privacy. We heard a little bit from Matt already about the anonymity that we use in the criminal justice system itself, but tell us about some of the other things that people might have a privacy interest in, especially as you've been working in the domestic violence realm.
So I agree with Reggie. This is a fundamental basic human right. The right to safety and security is guaranteed, right, by the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 3. And we're really talking about autonomy, self-determination, and confidentiality. Those are the three principles by which any advocate operates, right? And that's key to our work with survivors, that they be allowed to be autonomous human beings. They get to self-determine, and sort of fundamental to those rights is the right to privacy. The kinds of information that Matt alluded to, intimate details of what happened. Survivors will often say, I don't want other people knowing that. I don't want to have to talk to strangers about this information. So I think that's a driving force around the need for privacy for survivors. They override that when they have to participate in the system, but it's really core to why they deserve privacy. They should get to decide what information gets shared and who gets to see that information. Lots of times survivors have said, other people in my life don't know about what's happening to me. And I don't want to be forced into a situation where the system gets to broadcast this news about me, right? And so that can be difficult for survivors, especially when it involves significant injuries, sexual assault, intimate details of things that have happened that they now have to talk about in the open arena. The ways that we collaborate, law enforcement, none of us are allowed to exchange any information with anyone else without victim consent. That's a given. It's been that way forever. Like Sojourner cannot say anything about any contact we've had with anyone unless we have written permission. And we have to execute those agreements often with survivors, which is the other thing. Today, I may want my information to be shared with you as a prosecutor. Tomorrow, I may change my mind. And I have that right as an autonomous human being to shift my decision-making. And we have to be able to follow you and how you make those decisions. So we have strict confidentiality statutes that are in place that allow us to share. I think Marsy's law just adds another level of protection around that. We really should not be exchanging any information without victim consent, survivor. So that should be our number one principle that drives how we work. We collaborate with a number of agreements. And what I find is when you make a connection and have a rapport and a tune with survivors, they're more than willing to allow you to share their information if they understand the value that it has and how it's going to be shared. That, I think, is the other key piece, is survivors need to understand why you want the information and how will it be valuable to helping them achieve safety and security in their own lives.
Thank you, Carmen. And again, I completely agree with what you've said. So what I'd like to do is just share some of the questions that have come through so that we can get to these. We've got a little less than 10 minutes left. There are a couple of questions relating to the survivors, victims who have a disability. And in particular, this questioner is talking about a developmental disability, like an intellectual disability. And the particular question involved a sexual assault of somebody who is an adult but has a disability. And it looks like, and I'm going to actually go back to the question here so that I don't miss some important information here. So what the questioner describes is that the adult victim is on the autism spectrum, and that chronologically she is an adult, but cognitively she's a child. And her question then goes to, where do disabled victims go and where do families go to connect with appropriate resources? She says that many would rely on their churches. And if they disclose to their churches, those church leaders aren't mandatory reporters. And since they're an adult, I don't think that there is mandatory reporting under any circumstances. And it looks like no criminal charges were ever filed. I don't know if it was ever reported to police, but she talks about how this is problematic for them. So I'm going to throw this out to the group. When we have a victim who has some sort of a disability, whether it is an intellectual disability or it is a physical disability, what are the resources and what are the connections that we have in our community? Matt?
Thinking about it from a law enforcement and a prosecution perspective, I think the first thing I would say is it's our responsibility to understand and respond appropriately to the disability. So we want an interview done by an individual who understands, and for example, in this particular case, if the individual has autism and communicates at the level of a child, I want a person who's trained in interviewing children to conduct the interview of that individual. I may have it done on a recorded forensic interview, for example, like we do for child victims. And I will do my best to file a motion under the residual hearsay exception under Wisconsin law to argue that that statement should come in into the courtroom to provide further level of protections and to demonstrate the trustworthiness, quite frankly, of the statement for its admissibility in a courtroom. So I think we have talented individuals in our community, and we should never accept the any sort of explanation that, well, this individual has a disability and therefore that makes it more difficult for us to respond. We absolutely have to reject that. We have to have the appropriate response to investigate the most vulnerable victims within our community and make sure that they are protected as every bit as much as any other within our community. And I think we do have those resources in our community.
Thanks, Matt. I will add to that there is a group called Disability Rights Wisconsin that works throughout the state. They have a number of different particular locations, but they do work throughout the state. And so they work as directly as advocates like Marianna's group and like Carmen's group does with victims who have disabilities. And it covers a huge, really the full spectrum of all kinds of disabilities, but those include intellectual disabilities. And we work, I will say that law enforcement and prosecutors do work closely with Disability Rights Wisconsin. I'm also happy to say for any prosecutors out there who are listening that we are doing, the Department of Justice is sponsoring a disability rights training for prosecutors and other interested stakeholders. This will be in June, so 2-part trainings, and they're collaborating with Disability Rights Wisconsin on that. So one of the other questions that relates to this is what do the advocate groups like Marianna's group or Carmen's group, how do you at all connect or work with adult protective services when you have somebody who is an elder or an adult who is like a special needs person?
We work with our advocates work with case managers in the adult protection arena, and we also serve clients and their family members through the restraining order process. So we provide all of the services that we would normally provide. We do it in conjunction with the protective parent, the parent, or a caseworker from the division, whether it's an elderly client or someone from the adult protective services.
Thank you for that. Now, I will say that Adult Protective Services, they do some investigating on their own, but really, for a criminal prosecution, that investigation needs to be done by law enforcement. So there needs to be law enforcement involvement, and that's actually a really important part of this piece. So that I think is important. So for the person who was asking the question, you mentioned that you did not get a list of community resources. And so what I would do is refer you to Marianna and Carmen as individuals who may be able to help you even now get connected with resources, because I never think that it's too late in the process, regardless of what has happened before. This can really be a game changer for you all. Another viewer asked about what sort of collaboration there is across counties. And in their particular circumstance, the crime happened in Milwaukee. They moved to Waukesha to be more safe. But now what their experience is that neither Milwaukee nor Waukesha wants to provide them with services because they're sort of pointing fingers. So do we see this happen a lot? And what do we do across communities like this, especially here in the metro Milwaukee area? We're working with Waukesha and Marsy, Kenosha.
Yeah, we've seen that frequently. We do cross advocacy with organizations like the Women's Center in Waukesha and Sojourner do share cases. So I don't know if this particular case was a sexual assault, but we do work on cross-county domestic violence cases, cross referrals. We work in both systems. We've done expert testimony. We've done support in the Waukesha County system, and we reach out to the Waukesha Women's Center. So there are relationships that span all the counties.
Marianna?
We do too, especially when it comes down to Spanish-speaking victims, immigrant victims. We collaborate a lot with Unidos, who also provide supportive services to victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. But also through like our trafficking program, we have statewide connections. You know, when we're dealing with labor trafficking cases or sex trafficking cases, it is incredible to see the jurisdiction, you know, when it comes down to the sex trafficking cases between Milwaukee and Green Bay or Appleton. And so there's a lot of real strong collaborations from different victim service agencies to prosecutors. So we really work very hard at really developing those relationships so that it best serves our clients. It's our number one role here, is to best serve our clients and make sure that their rights are always protected.
So thank you for that. And I'm going to also suggest that, you know, another resource for people that can help them get pointed in a good direction is that system advocate. So the person who is on in the DA's office, who's working with the victim and the victim's family, if they know that you know, let's say you move to Texas, and believe me, we've had plenty of people who don't live in Milwaukee, who are victims in Milwaukee, and they either didn't ever live in Milwaukee or they've moved from Milwaukee. Your victim advocate in the DA's office also equipped and considers it part of their job to try to get you connected with some resources in the community where you are. So if you haven't turned to them yet, and, you know, really push the issue, if you have to, say, we want some services and we need to have some help connecting with them, they would be happy to help you do that. They really would. All right, let me take a look at the time here. Did somebody, oh, Matt, go ahead.
I was just going to add really quickly, we have a witness protection unit too in Milwaukee County that will communicate with different jurisdictions. So if you do move out of county, they will communicate safety concerns to local law enforcement to make sure that local law enforcement is aware of the health safety plan. They will also look into and investigate claims of intimidation too.
Excellent. All right, so we've got 2 minutes left, and I think that we should wrap up with sort of personal notes from each of you. So I'm just going to go around, and my last question to all of you is this: if you had a son or a daughter or a close family member who was a crime victim, what would you tell them about how to engage with the system? And let's start with you, Matt. You're at the top of my screen.
I was really hoping to go last. There's so much wisdom on this panel. I was hoping to hear from everybody else. As a member of the system, I would tell my son or daughter to trust and believe in the system, trust and believe in the advocates. It's not a friendly process necessarily to victims, but it's the human beings that are involved that help you get through the process and help bring healing through that process. And so, I work in a very cold building, a very cold complex, but it is the human beings that I encounter on a daily basis that reach out through their hearts and minds to try and help victims and take them through their journey and find some peace of mind. And so I would tell them to trust.
Natalie.
I'm pondering long and hard because, you know, like that's not to me, it's not all that easy being
Right.
a victim of a crime, you know, that could nearly leave you hopeless. But what I say to my daughter is to trust yourself, honor yourself, because that's something that I've had to do over and over again when systems are not in place and they're not, you don't feel as hopeful. But I had to really trust myself along the way and continue to keep doing that.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And that's exactly what this is to really develop that empowerment in your own thinking. Carmen.
Oh, I was just thinking, I would say, first of all, I agree with Matt. Human beings make the difference. No matter what we do in life, it's the people who carry us through. So I would say to her, I'm here, number one. And let's find the human beings that are going to help hold space for you as you navigate the ups and downs of this complex process. And I would say to her, I know you're going to be all right. I believe that. Let's find the people who'll help you find that place for yourself.
Marianna.
I would, I've been very much similar to what Carmen has been, just said. One is that I would would tell her that that I believe everything that's happening, that she is saying, that she is valued, and that she will not be alone, and that we will walk together on this and make sure that together we can safely bring the people, to help us through this safely.
Thanks. And Reggie?
Yeah, everyone has said everything that I was thinking, and I think said it profoundly. And I just want to echo the one that sits with me the most is what Natalie said in terms of trusting herself, and knowing that she's not alone, and just continuing to fight, and not giving up, even the system does.
Yeah, you guys are almost going to make me verklempt now. I mean, really, it goes back to those sort of two things. You are special and important, and look for the helpers, right? I mean, we can go back to Mr. Rogers, honest to God. So I want to thank you all, my panel members here, for doing this. I've learned a ton. I've been taking crazy notes here, and I really appreciate the time that you took to prepare for this and to participate today. And I hope that all of you in the audience have walked away from this with just even a little bit more information about what Marsy's Law is, and why we're all really excited that we have it in Wisconsin, because we really want this to work for you and to make this bad situation better for you. Nella, I'm going to toss the ball back to you.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you again to all the panelists. What a great conversation and beautiful thoughts. And thank you all for being those beautiful humans and for listening to victims. On behalf of Marsy's Law for Wisconsin, I want to thank everyone for attending today's event. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.